What is up, y'all? I'm back now for another 1984 video. We're gonna do albums for that year. I've had so much fun doing the research for these music and movie deep dive videos. I've rediscovered a lot of music that I used to listen to, some that I still listen to, and some that I totally had forgotten about. So let's just get into it. Van Halen, 1984, probably the most important album for me from that time period. I owned several of the singles. I know I owned Hot for Teacher and I'll Wait on 45. I'll Wait's an interesting song because I think the narrative back then, they tried to be like they were a solid rock band, but it's come out that Michael McDonald actually helped write and play keyboards on that song, but Eddie had slowly been getting more and more into keyboards, and they got their first #1 with Jump off of that album. love Van Halen, and really love 1984. I think a lot of people consider their debut their best album just by energy wise and what it was, but this is their most cohesive vision of an album. I think it's a little short. Even there's whole videos out there breaking this album down, so I won't get into it too much. We'll just move along. Another one that really grabbed me, I think I remember in my preteen days, I was in 5th or 6th grade in 1984. Ooh, shit, that's getting a little too close to telling you how old I am. But Rock You Like a Hurricane destroyed my little prepubescent ears at the time. Love at First Sting still stands up. I put that whole album in the Flashbacks playlist, the 2024 Flashbacks, because it's got all of the 74, 84, 94, 2004, 2014 songs, and anything I can find on YouTube goes in that Flashback playlist. So scroll down through that and check out some of this stuff. But there's some of those songs on that album I don't think I ever had the whole Love at First Sting album. I remember the cover because it got banned for some reason. It doesn't even show any boobie or anything like that. Scorpions covers had been banned a couple of times before for sexist imagery. They kind of make fun of that in the Spinal Tap movie a little bit, and I'm sure that Scorpions was the brunt of that joke. Moving on. Rats, Out of the Cellar. They were the first of the second wave of popular glam bands, or what people like to call now hair bands. The first wave was the original bands from the Sunset Strip that had come out in 80, 81, 82. The Quiet Riot, Motley Crue, Dokken, and Wasp, and several other bands like that that were huge on the Sunset Strip. And Rat was right there in the middle of it, but their debut didn't come out until after some of those other bands got signed and started having some success. So Out of the Cellar, I wouldn't call that the debut because they had an EP before that, but solid rock record. It's funny that that's one that has become more commercialized because of Round Around getting so popular, because it's really a heavy album. There's a lot of drill, chunky, and gang kind of vocally background vocals, and it's not slick really at all. Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil, I think it come out in 1982 or 83. I didn't really look up when it actually came out, but you were still having lingering effects of that album. And Motley Crue was touring with Ozzy, and there was a lot of synergy between bands, the older bands and the younger bands. And I think they cover a lot of that in that movie, The Dirt. But just wanted to mention Shout at the Devil, even though it was more of a 1983 album. Getting away from some of the more commercial bands, you had Merciful Fate with Don't Break the Oath. And we had that album back in those days, and we discovered that band through imports. We had a place in town that used to sell imports, and I had a friend that would just go out and just buy records because of the covers or because of people that were listed on it or things that we had just heard about or read about. And we came up with Don't Break the Oath, and it's King Diamond is still one of my favorite artists of all time. The original Merciful Fate was so good. Their riffs were good. It was super satanic and evil, which we just loved back in those days. And I've listened to a few of the songs. Some of it doesn't quite stand up. His voice is hard to take sometimes, but love it. Merciful Fate, just love it. One of the bigger ones was Judas Priest, another one of the 70s bands that kind of redefined their role in heavy metal music. 1984 was Defenders of the Faith, with them at their most heavy. They got a little more commercial on Turbo within the next couple of years. I would consider this their pinnacle of the heavy metal days. I think Screaming for Vengeance a couple of years earlier was better, and I think their 70s stuff is even way better before they even went towards the heavy metal direction. But if you're into the metal, the studs and leather and the Harley and all that stuff, you can't go wrong with Defenders of the Faith. Alright, the next section is going to be bands that were rising that hadn't quite reached their peak yet. And first off, we'll talk about Metallica. And you had Ride the Lightning. My friend who would buy all those import records and all of the new stuff that was coming out bought this record on vinyl, and I went to check it out, and we just agreed it was just the most awful thing we'd ever heard. Who knew that within a year or two, Master of Puppets would come out and become one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. The sounds are so different. There's, they call Ride the Lightning, the producer Fleming Rushbaum, they call this his reverb period. This is about the same time there was an album by a band called Coven, and I remember hearing it back in those days and I didn't like it, and now I've heard it recently and the sound is almost exactly like Ride the Lightning, and I don't think they ever were able to top Fade to Black as a ballad. You could arguably say Sanitarium or Nothing Else Matters. Nothing Else Matters is technically a better song, but for my money, Fade to Black is the best, probably the best Metallica song of all time. I'll just go out on a limb and say it. Also, Dawkins' second album, Tooth and Nail. I think their biggest album would be their next one. Their most commercial anyways. But Tooth and Nail is just solid album. Just banger. Same producer as Motley Crue used, Tom Werman, and we listened to the crap out of that album back in the day, and some of the songs are on that flashback playlist, and it kind of stands up. It's kind of fun. Still like it. 1984 was also, I'll mention real quick, the year that MTV kind of cracked down on all of the heavy metal that they were playing. So a lot of bands were really kind of shortchanged. It kind of happened with Dokken. Right by the time they had put out the single that was the ballad, there's supposed to be the one that makes you huge, which All Alone is All Alone. Alone Again should have been their big breakthrough song. They're another band that just never could get their big break. They're like always right there on the front of every heavy metal trend in the 80s, and they just could never get the success that they deserved. Whitesnake Slide It In, I think it was more of a 1983 album, but it was overrun into 1984. The band lineup had changed a bunch from David Coverdale and a bunch of old 70s rockers to John Sykes being one of the most badass guitar players ever. And their next album obviously would become multi-platinum, probably diamond by now, I'm not sure. Queensryche's The Warning, after their debut with Queen of the Reich, and they put out this first album. The big song was actually the ballad Take Hold of the Flame. The rest of it's kind of just basic Iron Maiden rock. They hadn't kind of grown into their own yet, but solid record. Another one was Europe. Their second record called Wings of Tomorrow. They hadn't quite got to, the next album would be where they would get to the final countdown and all of that kind of those kind of things are like a double-edged sword in a career. It's like you get something that's that iconic that people still remember it 40 years later, but it was also the kind of the thing that'll pigeonhole you and kill your career too. So it's kind of a double-edged sword to have something like that. But Wings of Tomorrow is a great, great album. Europe, if it wasn't for Final Countdown, Europe would be considered one of the great European heavy metal bands. I don't think Joey Tempest's voice really fits the style that they're playing, because he is tailor-made for what hair band and glam metal ended up being. But the band at this point is on fire and just sounds great. Wings of Tomorrow is a great, great album. We'll get away from some of the heavy metal. In Excess had an album called The Swing, which had several hits on it. I don't remember that album, but I do remember the songs that were out then. U2's Unforgettable Fire, Pride in the Name of Love is a great, great song. And what was the other? I had another one off of that. That was one of those outside of our normal range of stuff that we liked. But I had a friend that got the Unforgettable Fire album, and we just couldn't understand why we liked it so much when we're supposed to be heavy metal guys. But that's a trend that's happened a lot. I'm always open to good music if some stuff just touches you, even if it's not in the genre that you're used to. Sammy Hagar had the VOA album. I call that rising. That's about the biggest that he ever got in his solo career. I Can't Drive 55, super, super huge song for him. And he had several other hits off that album that I had forgotten about. Two Sides of Love and Swept Away and songs like that. I loved that album when I was younger. I think I got that album through one of those 12 albums for a penny deals, and I used to listen to the crap out of it. There's a stupid song on there called Dick in the Dirt that preteen me just loved that album and that song. It was so stupid. But a video for VOA, which was originally supposed to be called Voice of America, shows him dealing with Cold War stuff and fighting the Russians and dismantling bombs, but he did it kind of tongue-in-cheek, the same way he did the I Can't Drive 55 video, so it's kind of fun. Another one of those bands that they all wore the same uniforms, and kind of one of the reasons why hairband stuff kind of got knocked down a peg, because it just kind of got a little silly, and with the costumes and the makeup and the hair and the videos and stuff. But Sammy Hagar was having fun with it. I love that album. So some of the bands that were in their peak year in 1984, I'd have to say Twisted Sister with Stay Hungry. We're Not Gonna Take It, and I Wanna Rock. Again, taking the costumes and the makeup and the silly videos way, way over the top. It's interesting that they're a big part of that glam rock stuff, because they were more from the East Coast instead of the Sunset Strip. Most of the hairband stuff originated most of the hairband stuff originated in Hollywood and Sunset Strip. I mean, you had bands from all over. You had bands from all over, from England and the Northwest and South and everybody eventually, but it kind of originated right there in Sunset Strip. But at the same time, you had bands on the East Coast that didn't get signed for a few years, like Cinderella and Twisted Sister. Now back into the heavy metal, you had Iron Maiden on Power Slave, which I think most Iron Maiden fans would consider their peak. They kind of went a little more commercial. It's just the same thing as, they kind of parallel Judas Priest through this time, whereas like Power Slave and Defenders of the Faith are their last true metal-y albums, whereas their next album, Somewhere in Time and Turbo, they both started getting more into synth guitars and try to stay up on the times with the technology and stuff. And I think both of those albums were a lot more commercial, but your true metalhead, Power Slave and Defenders of the Faith are the ones that you want there. Dio was on his second album, Last in Line, and that was the last of the classic Dio lineup. I think he kind of dipped down after that for a few years, and then eventually got back with Black Sabbath later on. But Last in Line is stellar album. One of the singles off of that I had totally forgotten about, and I forgot how good of a song it was. Mystery is such a great song. And then there's one song that the riff kind of just sounds like a truncated version of Smoke on the Water from his old employer in Rainbow. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Deep Purple, Perfect Strangers. Deep Purple had gotten back together after several years of doing other stuff, speaking of Ritchie Blackmore, Ritchie Blackmore had been doing Rainbow for probably the last decade before that. They decided to do the Mach 2 lineup of Deep Purple again, which that album is great. Non-heavy metal stuff, obviously The Cars, Heartbeat City, produced by Mutt Lange. It was their biggest album of all time. Most of their big hits, you might think Drive, Magic, they had probably 5 singles off of that album. Obviously Bruce Springsteen had Born in the USA, once again had like 7 singles off of that album. Never a humongous fan of Bruce Springsteen, but you kind of couldn't get away from that in 1984. Stevie Ray Vaughan, Couldn't Stand the Weather, Cold Shot. Good thing, the standout thing about that album is his cover of Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix. Genesis eponymous album was that year, and they had 5 singles off of that album. The same time that Phil Collins is doing all kinds of stuff solo and playing with Robert Plant and playing with Eric Clapton. And Phil Collins was probably the hardest working musician in 1984 and in the 80s in general. Phil Collins is kind of the Dave Grohl of the 80s. You also had Tina Turner, made her big, huge comeback that year. Private Dancer was a humongous album. Bryan Adams, Reckless was that year. Huge album. Obviously, Prince's Purple Rain. There's nothing that can be said about that album. I'd need a whole separate video to talk about Purple Rain. The Rolling Stones put out a video album, which was basically a greatest hits album on VHS. They had songs going way back and videos going way back for songs and some newer stuff. I think Undercover of the Night was newer. That was a trend that several bands were starting to try to make happen, was video albums where they'd take a VHS and say, this is our album, but it's on VHS. And there was some good ones, but it didn't quite take off the way they thought it was going to. 1984, Rush, Grace Under Pressure. What a great album. We just listened to that on the way to a show recently, and man, what a good album. Steeped in Cold War propaganda. They were singing a lot about nuclear war and the enemy and all that stuff, and a lot of the keyboards were heavy, but there was still a lot of guitars, and between the guitars and the keyboards, everything just sounded like air raid sirens or alarms going off. Everything was just blah, 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 and it just added to that feel. That album just feels cold to me. Love it so much. Grace Under Pressure. And then you also have King Crimson, the third of their, I guess you would call it the Mark III lineup when they got back together in the 80s. Three of a Perfect Pair. And I had that album on cassette, and I listened to it over and over and over again, and I just wasn't smart enough to get it, but I just knew I needed to just listen to that over and over and over and over again. And I was just trying to make myself understand it, and now when I put it back in my playlist, it should be in that flashback playlist for me to listen to. It just oh my God, it's just music that just goes right to my soul. Um, they're out celebrating 40th anniversary of that era of King Crimson right now with Steve Vai, Danny Carey, and original members Adrian Belew and Tony Levin. And I'd really like to see that live. I think it's coming. It's not even coming anywhere close to here. But now let's talk about debut albums from 1984. Yeah, Trouble's first album, which they would never get very big, and their better albums came in the late 80s, early 90s. But I always loved their sound. The singer had a great scratchiness to his voice, and there's super doomy Black Sabbathy stuff. I don't know what this debut sounded like, but first Trouble album, one I did listen to a lot and still try to listen to occasionally, was TNT's Knights of the New Thunder. That album was so good. It's a little dated now. You might not be able to stand some of the music on it, and definitely some of the vocals. Tony Harnell's voice just goes through the roof. This is not their best album, but good start. They couldn't figure out if they wanted to do Viking sword and sorcery kind of music, or if they wanted to do ballady Bon Jovi kind of music. So they kind of just threw everything against the wall in this album, and I like some of the epic stuff that they did in that vein, but the love ballad on that debut album is superb. Yngwie Malmsteen's first album came out, Rising Force. We were huge Yngwie fans back then. I just couldn't believe. I mean, obviously I was a big fan of Van Halen, but I just had no idea. I'd never heard guitar played like that before. Most of it's instrumental. There's a few vocal songs. They're not as good. Besides VOA, Sammy Hagar also did a one-off album with Neil Schon, who was on break from Journey, and they had Michael Shreve and Kenny Aronson on drums and bass, respectively. And they had kind of a minor hit with Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale, but I think the rest of that album is more rockin', and I think it's all live too. If the album isn't live, they also did like a video album of a live show, and Sammy Hagar, like I said earlier, was just in peak performance. So that's a great album. Never heard the whole thing, but what I have heard, it's stellar. Armored Saint's first album, March of the Saint, came out. They obviously would get way better. I enjoyed a couple of their later albums a whole bunch, but let's start there. Wasp's debut album came out that year. Metal Church first album. We got Metal Church on vinyl, and I thought that was an import from Europe somewhere. They were steeped in that European heavy metal sound. Come to find out, they're from Seattle, which is just crazy to me to think that a metal band like that came out of Seattle. I love that first Metal Church album, and I love their second one too. In hindsight, the first one is the one that kind of stands up to the test of time. Celtic Frost's first EP came out, Morbid Tales. I've never heard that one, but their first few albums I was a huge fan of. That was more imported European metal that we just were blown away by back in those days. Back on the more pop side, Bon Jovi's first album came out that year, And to this day, whenever I hear that riff from Runaway, it just makes me smile. That whole song and that whole album is just phenomenal. Not near as good as what they would end up being, but it's a good solid debut. Some of the more alternative stuff, Red Hot Chili Peppers debut was 1984. Obviously, like I said, I wouldn't get into a lot of that stuff until years later, so I don't know that first Chili Peppers album, but I do know their next few up till before they were humongous. I was a big fan of Freaky Styley and the ones that George Clinton produced. But for Smith's album, which it would take me 20, 25 years to understand the impact of the Smiths, but now I'm kind of a fan. Not as much of a fan as I am of some of the other alternative bands from that time. Speaking of which, Depeche Mode's first album was that year, People Are People. I was a huge Cure fan, and I didn't really get into Depeche Mode until Chino from the Deftones kind of pushed a lot of that. Now I'm a humongous Depeche Mode fan. Art of Noise, if you listen to anything that I talk about on this video, Art of Noise should be the one that you should go and listen to. They were an experimental band. I think Trevor Horn, who was on top of the world at that time, between the Yes stuff and the Buggles stuff and everything else that he produced, I think he had a hand in that Art of Noise. The song from 1984 was called Beatbox, but super experimental. It's fun ear noise. They're called the Art of Noise for a reason. I always forget about them, but that should be considered one of my favorite artists of all time. Anyway, Run DMC's debut was 1984, and I think later in the year, Rockbox had come out, which became the first rap video that they ever played on MTV. So, yeah, 1984 was just kind of an innovative year for music all the way around. MTV was just up and MTV was just cruising along. Everybody was figuring out their way. There was room for everybody to have their unique styles, and yeah, that was most of the albums from 1984. So, see you next time.